our Thursday tea at 2, Michigan notables in the Civil War are my co-workers. This is Matthew Hackett, our Youth Programs Director. And you'll also be seeing Alex Konieczny and Sarah Feist, my newest co-worker, this afternoon. So that's our soldier and our lady with the cool hoop skirt. So we'll be hearing from them this afternoon. If you really like this presentation, and you have a group like a Bible study, a book club, a crafting group, other history lovers, let us know, because this presentation will travel. So we would love to do a program for you, or if you want to invite your group to come here, we can arrange that as well. But we'll be doing it the way that we usually do our Thursday teas today. So please help me welcome, we'll say Matthew, I think, to start, right?
That would be wonderful. So, of course, I do want to say thank you to Stephanie. Being able to be here as a presenter was just something that we talked about. It actually goes back further, though, and my second thanks is to Alex, because in August we went to a middle school that hadn't quite started their session in Farmington, and they were anticipating us coming to them and doing Civil War program. Well, we need something that would occupy those 8th graders for a 35-40 minute time, and one of the ideas that they liked, we're pitching ideas to them, what would you like us to do, was to hear more about connections that they could make to Michigan and specifically to Farmington. So I'm still working on the Farmington side of it, but so that's what Alex and I spun off of that. And then Sarah, who you'll see, as mentioned, dressed appropriately for this time of the year, and that place in timeline has helped not only with the fabrication of some of the things, but the research as well, and just the idea that she's willing to put on that hoop skirt and parade around is a pretty wonderful thing. So just thinking context then for this place, right? We're in a building that was a place of worship built in 1837, and you just take 1837 and add 25, you're going to be in 1862, and that's, we're learning terrible things about the men that have left the community into what was to be known as the Civil War, but at the time, just the war that they were all going to. So, travel with me a little bit in time, and there was an election, of course, in 1860, and it was going to cause some difficulties. The other thing that I put up there is the federal census of 1860, so that there's a place that we can go back to find out about some of these people before the war came into their lives. And that's really, for me, what happened during the war is important, what happened before the war is important, and what, if they were lucky enough to survive, where we find them after the war. But in that election, Lincoln prevailed, but before he even got inaugurated, we had states that were unhappy with this. And so there were 7 states, sort of started off with South Carolina and others. And we have now the first inauguration of a president that year in 1861 happens to be Jefferson Davis. So in February, he's the provisional president. So there's going to be a vote later that will confirm that, but they're trying to get things started early, I guess. And then we have the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln on March 4th. And I don't even know, it's crossed my mind that there's someone's book is called Across 5 Aprils. And so I just thought I'd use that. It's a war that lasts 4 years, but April, 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 and one more April, so it's 4 plus. And on April 12th, the Union has been moving provisions and fortifying one of the places that they hold in Charleston Bay, Charleston Harbor, and the Confederates have completely surrounded it. They have islands and parts of the mainland where they can train guns, and this is just sort of to get you all knowing how this comes about. After the fort is fired upon, the surrender is April 15th. Same day, Lincoln says, we need more troops. And then just immediately after that, 4 more states. Okay, if he's calling up troops, then 4 more states are going to leave. So we got a total of 11 states out. And I want to call your attention here to some of the darkened areas on this one, because the key, which maybe is not that easy to see, but anyway, the key is for the darkest areas are for against secession. So I don't know how much of this was known to this level of detail back then, but certainly there were, you could tell that there was a feeling in certain parts of those Confederate states that some people weren't keen on this. Just, does anybody recognize or would call out, please, one of the darkest areas?
West Virginia.
Yeah, the western part of Virginia. So it's the state of Virginia, but the western part has a lot of leanings like that. And then we could say sort of the same for what part of Tennessee? Eastern Tennessee, and then a little swath down to get into Alabama, and then some parts of Texas. But you know, our darkest areas, which are in terms of the Union, you know, this is a good thing, that there will be some sympathy there. There are some other areas. Who is completely for secession? South Carolina, North Carolina, and looking like Arkansas, based on that. And just there's all these tidbits. That's the other thing I find, you know, the more I learn, the more there's stuff that can connect it, and then there's more things that I'm chasing after that I don't have time for because I'm trying to get this all together. But Arkansas is Michigan's slave twin. So there was a compromise put together that going forward, if we're going to put in new states, let's make sure there's one slave state and one free state, and that'll keep, you know, the balance, and everybody will be happy. So it turns out that Arkansas would be the one that's the slave state that comes in when Michigan comes in within 2 years of. So you could think of it like that. I don't know that they would appreciate it, but that's just the way it is, as far as I'm looking at it. All right, so anyway, it's from across the Mississippi to the Atlantic, but there are 3 slave states that will not turn this time. It's Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland. Right. So here's Michigan's response to the first Michigan forms right away. Right in April 15th is the call out for troops. So just sort of as quickly as the word can get out, they're getting together, and it's still May by the time they arrive in Washington. And another Michigan connection we have is that Lieutenant Norman Hall from Raisinville in Monroe County, he was the youngest federal officer at Fort Sumter. So he's an artillery officer, and he's a graduate. Let me get my glasses on for this. Graduate of West Point in 1859. And we'll also get, thanks to what's available, a letter to his commander, Anderson, in February 1861 of how shall we reinforce Sumter. So he's giving ideas on how best to do this. This is all before being fired on. So when those troops do arrive in Washington, one of the claims is that Lincoln, noticing these troops and that they were could have been called Western troops at the time because of where Michigan was situated. Where are those troops from? He queries, and they find out they're from Michigan. Well, he says, thank God for Michigan. All right. Michigan's 2nd Infantry enlists pretty quickly too. So 1st, 2nd, we're going to work our way through eventually. And among the enlistees there is someone who goes by the name of Franklin Thompson. And Franklin Thompson is really Sarah Edmonds, and she has been living in the Holly-Fenton area as Franklin Thompson, but she feels strongly about the war, and she's going to leave her situation as a Bible salesman and join up with the 2nd Michigan Infantry. So she does that in May of 1861.
She's disguised, right?
She's disguised. She, in a little bit, we'll see how she could pull that off. All right, and then the scale of Michigan's involvement, it'll depend which website you go to. I've seen 90,000, and most everybody will say more than 85,000, so that's where I'm going with it. But they don't all necessarily serve in Michigan regiments. You know, you could go to Ohio from Michigan and serve, and it might take us a while, even today, to sort out that you started your life in Michigan or you claimed Michigan as your home. But among those eventually forming, 16, 18 artillery batteries, a unit of colored troops, and the engineers and mechanics, sharpshooters, sailors too. So that's one end of it. And then it's going to be 30 infantry regiments and 11 cavalry units by the time we get through the war. And I don't think I brought it in, but a regiment would be about 800 to 1,000 men. So each time one of those forms, multiply it by 800 or maybe 1,000 if they're at full strength. And the cavalry units are a bit smaller, and the artillery batteries are smaller as well. All right, so bring us to timeline 1861, and we've got the Michigan Light Artillery, which is mustered May 28th. Battery A in particular has some Troy Oakland men in what's also called the Coldwater or Loomis Battery. The commander was Colonel Loomis, but just let me try these names and see if they sound familiar to somebody in Troy. George Beach, Frank Cutting, Porter French, Clark Harris, James Voorhees. Whoops, I'm sorry, didn't mean to do that. There's another place where I can scroll down to get my notes, and that's what I didn't do. So they go south to action at Rich Mountain, which happens to be a victory for a fellow by the name of George McClellan, and that sort of pushes him to the fore. While that's happening, though, and I guess it's already come up, on to Richmond, and I don't know if you've heard this one, but the Yanks were in Virginia, McDowell their command, as fine a Yankee officer as any in the land. Their cry, "We're off to Richmond," was heard from every mouth, except they didn't reckon with the Army of the South. So you can tell which point of view that comes from. So the first enlistments are for 3 months. They think the war is going to be over. So that first Michigan Infantry has gone out there, mostly with people signing up from what we could call the southern tier of counties. So that would be Wayne, Monroe, Lenawee, and proceeding westerly. And it was led by Detroiter, Colonel Orlando Wilcox with 2 L's. Helps you if you're searching for him, always 2 L's. And July 21st is the first Battle of Bull Run, sometimes called the worst picnic of all time. If you went to view it for fun, it wasn't fun. And when the hillside that you're watching from looks like it's going to be taken over by those people that you wanted to watch get pushed back, and then you don't like that either. There's among the people taken is a congressman. I should have written this in the notes, but a congressman from New York, was captured and held by the Confederates for months. You know, he was a strong Republican, and like I said, he was out there as to see them get defeated, and so guess what? He's now in their control. So here's a picture of Orlando Bolivar Wilcox. So probably somebody in his background thinking, oh, we'll give him a middle name for somebody famous, Simon Bolivar, who military man in South America. All right, so here's, thanks to the Library of Congress, part of the battlefield as taken. I don't think we have the photographer identified, but this isn't necessarily the same part. So I can go back to show you, but and check out that tree, by the way. Does it look like that's going to stand much longer? No. So the artillery and the weapons. Oh, sorry. I'll go back just so you can see. You know, just a wonderful farm area outside of Washington, not too far. All right, so there's going to be a civilian response to this, right? Nurses are going to be needed. This is not going to just last 3 months. Let's do that. And there'd been a meeting even before the war. Maybe Detroit's ready for a new hospital. And the Duffields were involved in this, and some other folks as well. But there was a Reverend Duffield at the Presbyterian Church, and he agreed to have the first meeting for this idea of having a new hospital at his house. And some land becomes available. Lorraine was talking with me today and saying, we should really get the name of the woman on whose property it went. So the money side of it you'll recognize right away, but I don't have the name of the woman that, but she donated the land as well. But more land was donated by somebody else, and so it gets named after that. And Detroit is the first place that we see in November 1 of 1861 that the Ladies' Aid Society is going to form, and that's going to grow into Michigan Aid Society, and then they're going to look for ways to help the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which is sort of the government's official side of it. And now it's 3-year enlistments. And so by December of 1861, this is what Michigan had gotten together and sending them to places where they're going to be used or needed. 13 of the cavalry, 13 of the infantry regiments, 3 of the cavalry, and 3 batteries of artillery. We already mentioned that a number of Troy people have gone off for that. All right, and this started in April, but you know there's already prisoners of war, and nobody really knows how this is going to go. So it's cold. There might have been some minor skirmishes, but the armies hadn't quite formed or gotten to their places. And then just for the timeline for today, I don't know why I'm putting it in here. I guess it's because it's 1861. Today, January 24th, 1861, Lucy, a female slave from Wheeling who fled to Cleveland, Ohio, is returned to her owner. She is the last slave to be returned under the fugitive slave law. So as this separation is happening, the Union is looking at some of the laws they have, and we only have these to serve these people who are now rebels, so let's no longer enforce the federal side of it. We'll find that there's exceptions down in the South for quite a while, but in terms of the honoring that federal law, not going to do it anymore. All right, and then so we'll move out of winter quarters to see what the Union is doing. They're trying to blockade all of the Confederate states, and they're working their way through the Atlantic ports and the Gulf ports, and the Mississippi and Ohio rivers are pretty much in their control, or will be, but it's going to be incomplete at Vicksburg, and that proves to be significant for quite a while. The land movements, meanwhile, are into Tennessee, where Nashville, seeing that Union batteries are coming up, batteries meaning artillery, makes a deal, strikes a deal and says, let's call us an open city. You know, don't bombard us. That will just destroy this lovely city. Happens to be the capital, the 8th largest city in that confederacy, and as an open city, the Union walks in without having to destroy it first. Also in 1862, we have the 15th Michigan formed. It's going to use Monroe and Macomb counties, but there's more counties than that. Again, once they're forming, if you find out that it's forming in Monroe and you can make your way there from Detroit because you want to join up, they're not going to turn you down. And on the 15th Michigan is on the move in March. They're taking trains to get down into Ohio, and they're getting on the Ohio River to get to the Tennessee River. All right, and because Nashville is an open city, this young lady here, and again, here's me trying to use the mouse to do one thing when it'll do another if I'm not careful. Get my notes. This is Mary Jewett, and she's not originally from Michigan, but after the death of her parents, her brothers and sisters were living in Michigan, so she came to Michigan when she was pretty young, and was able to start teaching when she was about 14, so she's pretty sharp. And she was teaching in Kentucky when it looked like things were getting dicey, and so she came back home. As she comes back home, her brother enters, gets into the, I think it's the 4th Michigan Infantry, and she goes to Governor Blair and she says, I would like to serve this Sanitary Commission that's here. And, well, no, you're too young. She's, I have to remember, 22 years old. You're 22 years old. We don't let women do that when they're 22 years old. But she persisted and eventually wore Governor Blair down. That's Michigan's governor. And so she's permitted to go to Nashville, where there is a need for the Sanitary Commission. And that's going to have us learn a little bit more about the Sanitary Commission.
So the U.S. Sanitary Commission was formed at the beginning of the war, and their emphasis was on educating people and creating more sanitary conditions in the hospital. More people died from disease during the Civil War than they did from gunshot wounds or just being in battle. So the Sanitary Commission was very important in that. One thing the women did is that they were in charge of collecting supplies and funds. The government did not fund this commission at all. It was all volunteer-based, and everything that they raised from having sanitary fairs, which are big events. There was one held in Kalamazoo, there was some held in Chicago, and all over the northern states. At these fairs, they would have different people exhibiting kind of like a show, or they'd be selling goods. Farmers might sell like their fruits or vegetables there as well to raise money. And like other figures you hear about the Civil War, they're not totally sure the amount of money that these women were able to raise. Some of the numbers are about $25 million, and that's in 1865 money. Today, that would have been a lot more than that. These women, they also worked very hard to help the men once they returned home. They would provide food, lodging, and care for the veterans who came back. So when they were still getting back into society, they'd have homes for them to live in, and they'd help them out. Because of their work, people learned about how to prevent diseases and how to help people get better once they were sick. They taught people how to plan out their camps. Maybe not have your latrine right next to where you're getting your drinking water from. Get sick from drinking that dirty water. Some of the supplies the women would collect would be bandages. So they would take just pieces of cotton, or flannel, rip them apart and roll them. We needed lots of bandages for the men. Sometimes if there weren't enough bandages, they might take one off one person and give it to the other, because they're not bleeding anymore, but this person's bleeding. So we needed clean bandages. So they put together these boxes of bandages, pens, and paper for the soldiers, also food, clothing, anything they would need. These women really want to support them. Some of these women were able to travel down to the areas and help out in the hospitals. They wouldn't be dressed exactly like me, but when they were here in the city, they would be dressed like this. They would also help the veterans obtain their pensions. A lot of time during the war, you'll read in letters that were sent home that they haven't been paid in a while. Getting paid during the Civil War is a problem for a lot of the units, not just ones from Michigan. And so the ladies, they would help a lot with veterans trying to get these pensions paid and also back pay to these people and their families that were here. So women had a large role in writing letters to these men to, keep their spirits up and to help them fight and to know what's going on back home. You'll read a lot in their letters. They have a lot of questions like, oh, how are they doing? I'm sorry that I'm not feeling well, or I'm sorry you're not feeling well. So you can tell a lot that these women really did care about these men, and they wanted them to succeed, and they wanted them to come home safe and healthy and not very sick. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, with Nashville in Union control, there's an army that Johnston, and there's a couple of Johnstons, so I want to be sure I give you the right one. Albert Sidney Johnston is retreating out of Tennessee into Corinth, Mississippi, and that's going to kind of foreshadow what's next here. Timeline 1862. There's a place called Shiloh, Tennessee, and it's on the Tennessee River. One of the access points to get into the tiny community of Shiloh is a place called Pittsburgh Landing. And this is the area that used to be controlled by Albert Sidney Johnston, but he's retreated to Corinth, Mississippi. So the Union decides that they can bring some of their soldiers and bring the war into one of these states. And so on April 6 and 7, not quite realizing that the Confederate States folks have about 40,000 people who aren't exactly in Corinth, Mississippi right now. They are actually moving close to Pittsburgh Landing. So this is going to be 40,000 plus Confederates versus an eventual 65,000 Union. And I had mentioned before that the 15th Michigan, they've just formed. Went on trains down to Ohio, got in ships that took them on the Ohio River into the Tennessee River, and they arrive. And Alex was reminding me today, so when Alex is a reenactor, he's with the 15th Michigan, and so he's been to Shiloh and to Pittsburgh Landing. When they first arrive, they hear the sounds of the battle and they want to get off the boat, and so they do get off the boat, and they're ready, except they don't have ammunition. So, there's a distance that they've made from them and the boat, and maybe the boat has to go back to get more soldiers because they've sort of dropped them off in various places and are shuttling them forward as they need them. So once they have ammunition, they see part of that battle as well. And Michigan Light Battery B out of Grand Rapids is overwhelmed. They lose, I think it's 3 of their guns. As some of these battles transpire the way they do, Battle of Bull Run, major batteries or artillery are lost to the Confederates. Here's another instance where some of those are lost, and that helps their war effort. They're not really equipped to build as many weapons as the North. All right, meanwhile in Williamsburg, Virginia, on May 5th, we've got the Fighting 5th Michigan is there, and a fellow by the name of, if I do it in French, it would be Abel Peck, but he might just have been Heber Lefevre. I'm not quite sure. And he's wounded pretty significantly for people seeing him because he's struck in the face and in the arm. And we have a Troy connection with Private Albert Smith. And see, I don't trust myself. That's part of it too. That I think I know this, but let me look at the notes just to be sure. So if you've been on the cemetery walks, and a couple of people came up and said, I appreciate that you've done those cemetery walks, and they sort of have prepared me for this in a small degree. Albert Smith is buried at Union Corner Cemetery. He was killed in action at Williamsburg. I'm not sure whether he's really buried there or whether it's new vocabulary for me, a cenotaph. So that's where a marker that indicates a memorial to somebody who's lost, but they're actually buried someplace else. So I'm not quite sure. It was produced later, so unless they were able to get to Williamsburg and retrieve his body, or it was early enough in the war that they were still doing that, pretty soon they're going to be overwhelmed and can't move those bodies. Got to bury them where they are. So he's at Troy Union Cemetery. He was killed on his 26th birthday. All right. Okay, so now we're back to Michigan. Things happening out. There's some Oakland County recruiting that's going on. July and August, the 5th Congressional District, which is 5 different counties. I don't know if I'll be able to name them all for you, but Oakland, Macomb, St. Clair, Lapeer, and Sanilac. There, got all 5. So we're going to find that when we look at how those are composed, maybe one area is mostly Oakland, one of the companies, and one might be more Macomb, but together they're going to get about 800 guys from there. And they're going to be led by Moses Wisner. The governor has approached him and suggested that he could be in charge of this. He's the former governor of Michigan, so here's a chance for him to do what he wants to do. He's strong Republican leanings, and if you'll remember, Mr. Lefevre, he's in there as lieutenant colonel. And don't read too carefully at the bottom. I'll have to explain that in just a moment. But can you tell that he was injured in the face? Yeah, and there are better pictures, unfortunately not available online as I was putting this together. So at Pontiac, Michigan, the 22nd Michigan musters and used the fairgrounds in Pontiac for drilling. There's still a marker there that can be seen, and I'd have to go in order to tell you more about exactly where it is. I sort of got this vague idea where the fairgrounds used to be, but it's on the north side of Pontiac, and Troy and Bloomfield recruits to the Pontiac, the 22nd Michigan, include about 38, sort of how Bloomfield might want to claim them, and we might want to claim them, and but 38 men. Farmington, and here for me it's more clear, they contribute 30 men to this, and in September about 900 men are traveling by train to Cincinnati, eventually across the Ohio River to Camp Etta Bishop, and that was another of those, Stephanie described them as rabbit holes. Okay, Camp Etta Bishop. I kind of have to know, how come you name it Etta Bishop? And so, search again and find out that Etta Bishop in Kentucky saw some people whose sympathies were different from hers sort of dragging this flag and through the mud, and that was the flag that she recognized, and she didn't want to see them do that. And so here she is, 18 years old, and she accosts them and tells them, they're not worthy of doing that, and she wants that flag up off the ground, and sort of in 18-year-old if this is what's right to you fashion, she prevails. And they're going to name the Army camp in honor of Etta Bishop. All right. The further story to Heber Lefevre is that he's going to become acting colonel when the former governor, right, somebody who should be able to access the best medicine, he dies of typhoid. It's going through the camp, January 5th, 1863. All right, so the Wayne County recruiting is just a little bit off, right? So July it was happening up in the 5th Congressional District, but Wayne County in August in the 1st Congressional District, which is mostly Detroit and Wayne County, they put together what's the 24th Michigan. And it's going to be led by a Detroit judge, although we'll now call him Colonel, Henry Morrow. And a picture of him. And if, you know, Ambrose Burnside didn't get there first, I think we would call those Morrow sides. All right. And now we're going to move to a place called Antietam. And the 17th Michigan is just 1 month into its formation, and the 17th Michigan happens to have a number of students who previously attended U of M and the Michigan Normal School. Anybody know Michigan Normal is? Eastern Michigan, thank you. Yep, you know your stuff. And this is a place where a fellow by the name of Robert E. Lee is leading a lot of troops across. Their plan is to get into Pennsylvania by way of Maryland, and this is going to disrupt things that have been happening, and maybe get some troops out of Virginia, which is kind of bothering Lee and his company. And the counter moves are by George McClellan and the Army of the Potomac. And thanks to a book called Michigan at Antietam, there's a pretty neat thing about, they find some orders that are sort of lost. You know, somebody went to smoke a cigarette and or a cigar, and actually it's the cigar that attracts the attention of some Union guys. Hey, is that a not all the way smoked cigar on the ground there? And he goes over and finds that, and this packet that seems to have some orders. And, well, you know, could this be one of those, they want us to find this, and it's going to tell us the wrong thing? But under Lieutenant Pittman and the Lost Order here, so that's the name that it travels under today. It's the Lost Order. What is Lee going to be doing? You know, he's written this down and he wants it communicated through his lines. There happens to be a fellow there who is has worked as a teller in Detroit, and since this is signed by R.H. Chilton, and R.H. Chilton used to do some of his banking in Detroit, this one guy out of 75,000 men who could verify the signature happens to be there and says, yeah, oh, I recognize that. You know, back in those days, how did you recognize people, you know, by their signature or on site? There's not photo ID for everybody and social security numbers. So this gives veracity to, we now have what Lee's plans are. So that gives McClellan a chance to do something. And we'll get there, but the size of this conflict still resonates today. All right, so that 17th Michigan, right? They've been together for about a month, and they have action that involves them scrambling over a wall to engage the enemy. And so their nickname for some time is the Stonewall Regiment. But there's a cost. At South Mountain, this is one of the early actions at Antietam, 26 killed, 106 wounded. And if you'll remember Colonel Norman J. Hall at Sumter, he's been put in command of the 17th Michigan. So he's been at Sumter, now he's here at Antietam and watching people get lost under his command. So he'd also been, he'd also been with the 7th Michigan at 2nd Manassas, and yeah, my notes don't, sorry about that. Notes don't populate with when I'm supposed to say them, so. So the 7th Michigan, I think I said he was in charge of the 17th. So he's in charge of the 7th and has been at 2nd Bull Run with casualties. Here it's high casualties, 4 officers killed, 12 officers wounded. There's about 12 companies, and each of them has about 4 or 5 officers at the top. So this is really significant loss. And this battle will also, we could say, introduces, even though he's been around, a fellow by the name of George A. Custer. He has chosen McClellan's headquarters, happens to be the Pry House, which is high above on a bluff overlooking Antietam Creek, and McClellan can see what's going on from there, except for the smoke. And Julia Wheelock, and we'll have Sarah come back to tell us a little bit more about her. She's in Washington City, and she's going to receive some of these wounded as they come out of Antietam. As Sarah comes up, the size of the conflict still resonates today. More people, more Americans killed on that one day than any engagement after. But, you know, it's Americans fighting Americans, so that's also part of the equation.
So Julia Wheelock, she moved to Michigan in 1851 to live closer to her brothers, and she attended Kalamazoo College while she was there, and she became a teacher. And when the war broke out, she was still teaching, and her brother, Orville, joined the 8th Michigan Infantry, and he went off to war. In September of 1862, she got word that her brother was injured. So herself, her brother, herself, her brother's wife, and the sister of his wife, they all traveled to Virginia to try to find him and to help nurse him back to health. Well, little did they know, he passed away before they were able to get there. And instead of going back to Michigan to continue teaching, Julia decided to stay and help the cause. She worked in over 25 different hospitals all over. She worked a lot in Washington, D.C., but also did travel to other parts of the country at that time. She was an appointed agent of the Michigan Soldiers Relief Association, and she also got sick while she was helping treat these men. She contracted typhoid, and even when she was sick with typhoid, she still continued to go out and raise money for the Michigan Relief Association to help support the soldiers. She gained the nickname the Florence Nightingale of Michigan. She was really passionate about trying to improve all the conditions in the hospitals. She knew herself that, you know, they weren't clean, they weren't sanitary, and these are why these men were dying. So she tried her very best to make the conditions nice and clean for them, and so that they would get better. She would work 12-hour days, and then after her day at the camp, she would go back to where she was, and she would continue to work. She would bake pies, collect supplies for all these soldiers, and one thing she did write about in her journals is that she'd be so happy to take these things to the soldiers, but there was never enough. And it always made her feel really sad to know that she couldn't bring enough things for these men. They always needed more.
All right, thank you, Sarah. So the other people we could say are introduced. Abel Peck is there. He comes with the 24th Michigan. He's one of the color bearers, and he writes some letters home that are extant for us to look at. And the Michigan Soldiers Aid Society has some room in the basement of the patent office. So that's another place, probably Julia Wheelock is working there. And this also helps Abraham Lincoln with this idea that he has that we should have an emancipation, and what we need is a victory so that we sort of sell them together. You know, this is progress, freedom for slaves. So he comes to review the troops in Maryland. The 24th Michigan is there, not to fight, but as protection for the troops and to do some cleaning up and sort of after action, try to figure out what happened and what can we learn from it. So they are on site. And Alex tell us the name of that red spot. And I'm not sure they're wearing it at this point, but here's our 24th Michigan.
Everybody turning around. All right, so during the war, we had these things called corps badges start to show up. A red dot like this one is for the 1st Corps. It's First Corps, which I forget the name of the Corps commander at the time, but the Corps is a group of men. He was trying to give orders, and it turned out the orders he was giving was not to his own men. Because the thing about uniforms is they're all the same. So he says, all right, no more of that. I'm settling this. You guys are all wearing a red dot, so I know you're mine. Well, that idea starts to spread around a little bit, but the 1st Corps, of which the 24th Michigan is a part, wears that red dot. So that's one of those things that kind of tells you who belongs to what at that time.
All right, thank you. All right, so the announcement, oh, sorry, yes.
On that last screen, Michigan City, is that, not Michigan, Washington City, is that in Michigan here?
Oh, no, I'm just using the parlance of the day. It's not DC, it's just Washington City. Okay, so it's the same one we know as Washington, D.C., and I might have explained that, sorry, if it does cause confusion. All right, so the first announcement of the emancipation is made after Antietam, and the formal signing will be January 1st. So there are still people, no surprise, that celebrate January 1st. That's a pretty significant day in some lives in the past, and we should recognize it today. It applies to the slaves in the rebel states, so it's not going to apply in Maryland. It's not going to apply in Kentucky or Missouri. They're not rebels. They have slaves, but they're not rebels. But it does allow for the eventual formation of the United States Colored Troops in May, although in Detroit, there's been a group that the Free Press has been calling the Corps d'Afrique, which is just the Africa Corps, and they're going to become the first Michigan Colored Troops, and then eventually we put things together sometimes and they become the 102nd USCT, which is short for United States Colored Troops. So again, that's parlance used back then. We'd say African American or black, but colored troops back then. They all have white officers too. That's the standard. It's for the rest of the war. How long is this going to take, right? So they're joining in 1863. Gettysburg has action with over 2,600 men in 11 different regiments and 5 companies. The 4th Michigan is involved in a battle that's going back and forth, and their color, their banner is about to be taken over, and they have one color bearer killed, another one, Harrison Jeffords, comes forward. He's their commander. He's out of Dexter. 52 of that company are from Washtenaw County, so he's looking after people that he knows, but he was bayoneted securing the colors. Also, companies G, H, and I have 64 or more from Oakland County, and Abel Peck that we met at Antietam is killed. He's carrying the colors. And in fact, all of the color bearers and all of the color guard are killed from the 24th Michigan at Gettysburg. This was another one that Alex was referencing, but here it is with the numbers. So the 24th Michigan at Gettysburg on July 1st went to battle with 496 men. When they answered the call to assemble on the morning of July 2nd, 99 were there to answer it. So the others are wounded, missing, dead, maybe deserted, but it's probably those first three is more likely. All right, this will take us a little bit later in that year to Chickamauga, Georgia. And we've got Confederate General Braxton Bragg in the Army of Tennessee. And he's slightly outnumbered, but he thinks he can do something. And here's General William Rosecrans, Army of the Cumberland, and he's going to be a little bit outmaneuvered. There's a lot of, what caused it to slide this way and that, and luck is definitely in there too. It's going to be known as a victory for the Confederates, but it was kept from being a rout, taking over and capturing lots of prisoners or just killing them as they're fleeing by the command of General George Thomas. Anybody know what his nickname was after that? The Rock of Chickamauga. So it was key to covering the retreat of the thousands of Union soldiers who after dark managed to move into the stronghold at Chattanooga, but sort of left at on Snodgrass Hill are the 21st Ohio, the 89th Ohio, and the 22nd Michigan. The 22nd Michigan is that one that has a huge Oakland County connection. And they're now cut off and running out of ammunition. Snodgrass Hill is sort of adjacent to Horseshoe Ridge. The defense there carries the retreat, I guess is what we can say. My notes, 45 members of the Michigan 22nd were killed on September 20th. 178 men and 14 officers were taken prisoner, including our friend Heber Lefevre. And the officers were likely to go to Libby prison. The enlisted men, just two prisoners. There's a lot of prisoners being taken, and there's a bit of trouble because the prisoner exchanges aren't happening in late 1863, and they won't happen in any significant way until February of 1865. So these men who are prisoners of war aren't just going to be swapped out. They're going to have to stay. And the Michigan Light Battery A was also in this battery. So that's George Beach and Cutting and Voorhees, that crew. All right. All right. Things are going to go quickly to get us through the time that we're going here, but that's kind of the way it's been put together. So if you're with Grant, you're going to be at the Wilderness, and a number of battles, and thousands, tens of thousands of people are lost on their way to Richmond. They'll regret singing that song, right? And if you're with Sherman, you're going different groups, but you're headed to the sea, and that's going to include somebody that we haven't talked about, a good book about it, My Brave Mechanics, is the 1st Michigan Mechanics and Engineers. And two of my great-grandfather's brothers were part of that. So, by the way, their job as mechanics and engineers is to rebuild the bridges that somebody else has burned down or destroyed, and to tear up railroads that might serve so it's construction, destruction, construction, destruction, and if the things ebb a little bit, then it's build it again because they torched it and we've got to get our troops across on our way to Savannah. All right, that's going to get us to April, our final April of the 5, and the Grant and those that have been with his group have pushed Lee out of Richmond, and they meet outside of Richmond, a place called Appomattox Courthouse. And on April 9th, there's the official signing and surrender. On April 12th, the formal stacking of the arms and the parade and parole. So the Confederates are allowed to keep their sidearms and their horses, but their long guns are laid down. In Andersonville, Georgia, that prison is finally going to close, and many of the men that have been prisoners since September 1863 have been moved in there. There are 59 men from the 22nd Michigan buried at Andersonville National Cemetery. And the markers that we have locally for those are likely those cenotaphs. You know, they want a place to come locally to remember somebody that's gone. Crooks Road has 8 members of the 22nd Michigan buried there. So that's, if you're wanting to recognize the 22nd Michigan, it's over at Crooks Road Cemetery. All right, then we have the twin tragedies of Lincoln, to which I'll just throw in Joshua Predmore of Lake Orion, happened to be on duty at the White House, not too far from Ford's Theater. So he's, you know, once this thing that's happened at Ford's Theater, the assassination, he's called to the scene. So he's going to come back and live, and they're going to name a street after his family. So on the other side of things, oh, and it takes April 15th is when he passes away. Lincoln is gone. So that's a huge tragedy for the whole country. But, excuse me, there's another one brewing. April 24th, the Sultana gets to near Vicksburg and picks up these paroled prisoners. You know, so they're out of the prisons like Cahaba and Andersonville, and they just want to get home, but they can't do it under their own steam. I guess I didn't put it up there, but the train system that's delivering them to where they can get on ships is in terrible condition. So there's derailments, you know, so you've survived the battle. You survived being a prisoner of war, the train derails and you're killed. And I'm thinking those guys aren't buried in recognized places, you know. There, let's get this train going, move on. All right. Estimates are that nearly 1,200 soldiers, or excuse me, 1,500 get on board the Sultana steamship, and 7 miles north of Memphis, there's a big explosion and fire, and it's estimated that 1,200 of those 1,500 are killed. But we have Richard Henry Peer, who will later live in Wixom, was among the survivors of, so he survived, he was in the 22nd Michigan, so he survived Chickamauga, he survived Andersonville, he survived the ship going down. All right, and then we have the matter of Jefferson Davis to contend with. And here's notes written by Benjamin Pritchard of the 4th Michigan Cavalry. I think I've got the date wrong there, so if you're tracking me, there's a chance for the wrong date. But he's writing how the 4th Michigan Cavalry managed to capture Jefferson Davis. But it sort of becomes this whole thing. So, and Steph might have to help me out here because she actually looked at these more carefully than I did. But, you know, he's got the cloak of his wife over him. You know, it's a chilly day, and she's probably got more cloaks than he does. And so when they find him, suddenly in the media, it becomes oh, well, he was dressed like this. And, so my little joke is at least they got the boots right. Okay, so he was wearing boots under this cloak. And puns to the end, Jeff's last shift. So, another name for a dress being shift. All right, so I know I brought a lot of, this is a tough subject to bring out, Michigan and its contributions to the war. But I did bring a couple of jokes, so I'll put those in now. So a merchant requested to pass through Union lines to Richmond. Needed it from President Lincoln. And Lincoln chuckled and said he'd already sent 250,000 men in that direction and not one has got there yet. This one I made up myself. So what did the quartermaster say to the general on his birthday, that's significant, when the wagon train arrived? So what did the quartermaster say to the general on his birthday when the wagon train arrived? Supplies! Okay. All right. And then there were a whole series of these, and you can look them up. What's the difference between? So what's the difference between a greatcoat and a baby? Oops. One you wear and one you was. Oops. And there goes somebody's audio. Sorry about that. And I think I'll finish this, although I was going to do it at Shiloh, since they didn't really know that each other were there. Two lovers are like two armies. They generally get along until they are engaged. All right. So I think generally we open to questions. So if you have some questions, I think that's, final slide. So yes, thanks back there.
I tried looking up real fast on Google. We were talking did you say Etta Bishop?
Etta Bishop.
E-T-T-A.
Yes, and the last name Bishop, like somebody in the church. So they named the camp after her, and
Maybe I need to put the word camp together. It came up Etta James and everything.
oh, right. Yes.
So you had mentioned that at the end of the war, they couldn't effectuate prisoner exchanges. When they did do prisoner exchanges, what was the condition of the exchange? Were prisoners repatriated back to their units? Or
Yeah.
to not fight?
That was generally a condition of both sides, that you will promise that you will not go back into the conflict, and I don't know that they ever really expected that people had to honor that. And sometimes it was almost like a hostage situation. Think back to who it is. It's Wilcox, who's captured at Bull Run, and he's held for about a year. There are some Confederate privateers, so essentially pirates, that have been captured by the Union side, and the Confederates would like them back, and they happen to have this Wilcox, how about those privateers? Well, they don't want to give up pirates. They don't consider them in the same caliber as the regular fighters. Just to board a ship and try to take it over. That's not real war. Yes?
The 24th Michigan, I think, involved the Battle of Peach Orchard. I think it was the second day of Gettysburg. It was at Sedgwick. They had to leave Cemetery Ridge and advance when they weren't supposed to, and that's where they had most of their fighting.
So there's, if it's at Gettysburg that you want to refer to, then they're up against the 26th Carolina.
The 24th Michigan is most known for their engagement with the 26th North Carolina. Actually, both sides will suffer the highest casualties for their own army between the two of them. You might be thinking of Dan Sickles. Is it Sedgwick? Sickles. Yeah, he led his men out of, he was kind of in a sort of in the middle sort of position.
Yeah.
And he and the 4th Michigan and a bunch of other guys went down into the Peach Orchard, and they were thoroughly out of position and really way more casualties than there needed to be. He put himself in a bad spot. The entire Union line was covered, actually.
Yeah.
He thought he was really cool, and he got his leg shut off. He was smoking a cigar
And then that sort of leads me to, you know, I know what I presented here, but it's so vast once you get into it. How much could we know about this? And we live with it today. I made an analogy, I don't know if it's going to go over, of turning on the coffee pot in the morning. Okay? So I might not have been there when the coffee pot got turned on, but I might drink some of the coffee, and by the end of the day, I should be probably turning off that coffee pot and cleaning the thing. So history is like that as well, you know. It's delivered to us something that we didn't ask for, but it's here and it's with us, and we got to deal with it however we do. Hopefully for the better, and not just leave the coffee pot on. Yeah, last question, I think.
Just wondering, where did deserters go? Because there wasn't a mandatory draft per se. So did they just go back to farming, or were they considered ostracized?
Yeah, a lot of the companies formed would be of neighbors that know one another. So if it's clear that they know that you have done the skedaddle, they're not going to think well of you. So you might be moving out west. In some cases, you were just shot. That would be a way of dealing with it. And I've read of some things of branding. You know, brand your forehead with the letter D, and so sort of anybody thereafter will know that you made that choice, and I guess you're living with it.